Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Civic Podcast. I'm David Turner.
My name's Markus Wagner.
Markus, I'm excited to be doing this, our first episode.
Yeah, look, you and I met at a podcast that you're running, the Hearsay Podcast, and at least I felt afterwards, I was like, oh, that was a fantastic interview that you did. And then I reached out and said, why don't we do a few more of them? And here we are.
Yeah, I remember we went and got a coffee and you said, I think that went pretty well. We should do another one of these conversations. And I said, I was thinking the same thing. And now here we are. We've got a great episode today. We'll be speaking with Steve Vladeck, US legal scholar who's been doing some incredible scholarship on the bewildering amount of constitutional and federal law issues that the first 7 weeks of the Trump administration has raised. Before we get on to our interview with Steve, though, I thought I'd just give our listeners a bit of a primer on what the show is and why we're doing it, because I think that might help. So, Markus, you and I have very different professional backgrounds. I'm a practicing lawyer, occasional legal tech entrepreneur. Markus, you're a law professor. But something that matters.
You say that with disdain almost. I don't know what that slight hesitation was.
No, not disdain. Quiet reverence.
Okay, fantastic.
But I think something that, despite the difference in our professional backgrounds, we both share is an interest, maybe even a concern about the quality and tone of political conversations globally, but even here in Australia.
Yeah, look, I had this idea for a long, long time about doing a podcast, and it sort of crystallized after our conversation a little bit. And then what I was thinking sort of all along was we lost touch of how to talk with one another rather than at one another. And there might be plenty of reasons for this. The sort of on-demand landscape of media, that you can just get whatever, like the water cooler conversation isn't happening. Then you have these attention merchants, people making outrageous claims to attract attention, game social media algorithms, something we try to avoid, I think, on this podcast. And just people generally not talking about on a similar, at least similar factual basis. And now I'm betraying my age. The truthiness of Stephen Colbert, I think of 2005, somewhere early 2000s, comes back to mind. And then there's topics that people just seem to not be able to talk about in a reasonable manner, and we want to do all of that. Namely, to have conversations about uncertainty, discomfort in economic, political, legal landscape, but we want to do it without hostility, and we don't want to do it chasing a topic one by one within this 24-hour news cycle. So we disagree, but we disagree agreeably, if you will. That's, I think, the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly it. I think you're right. This sort of degradation of consensus reality is something that feels quite recent, but it's been this slow slide from the early 2000s, and it is something that concerns me. And on the show we'll have conversations with people we might not agree with. We might not even agree with one another sometimes, but we'll aim to do that acknowledging the facts and the truth of the matter, and we'll aim to do it in the spirit of a civil debate, and I guess that's really where the name of the show comes from. I don't think we'll have a huge amount to disagree with Steve today.
Probably not.
I suspect there'll be a lot of enthusiastic agreement today, but hopefully we'll make good on our promise in future episodes. This isn't a news show. We won't be picking up every headline story. We're not going to be commenting on everything that hits the press. We want to contribute our opinions and hopefully add something to our conversations about politics, the economy, and the law, and hopefully your conversations about politics, the economy, and the law that you're having in your own lives.
Right, and we might pick apart a book, if you will, an article sometimes if we don't have a guest, and we'll be building up slowly over time. I think that's where we are. Okay,
well, without further ado, let's welcome Steve Vladeck, constitutional law scholar at Georgetown University Law Center, GULC, onto the show.
The opposition party is the media. And the media can only, because they're dumb and they're lazy, they can only focus on one thing at a time. I said, all we have to do is flood the zone. Every day we hit them with 3 things. They'll bite on one and we'll get all of our stuff done. Bang, bang, bang.
So we thought we'd replay that Steve Bannon clip about flooding the zone from 2019, because that's in some ways what we're seeing at the moment. What we don't want to do in this podcast, as we said in the beginning, is to run after every bit and piece of news that the Trump administration is deliberately or not pushing out. Rather, the idea is we want to look at what lies underneath all the bits and pieces and ask if there's some larger project underlying this effort. Get into our interview with Steve Vladeck, no doubt, about firing of civil servants, birthright citizenship, DOGE, immigration, January 6 rioters, climate policy, CDC data, and so forth, just to name a few. And like I said, there really isn't anyone better to talk about the large developments in U.S. constitutional law and politics. So thanks for coming to our first show, Steve.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored that you'd have an American on.
Well, we're honored that an American is coming on so far away to Australia.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being here, Steve.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
By way of introduction, Steve and I don't think quite overlap at the University of Miami. I think I came a year or so after you left to American University initially, and now you're at Georgetown University Law Center. Which in itself is in some hot water, and we'll get to that, I'm sure. And you're the Agnes Williams Sesquicentennial Professor of Federal Courts, and I think I have this right. You teach constitutional law, national security, military, war and peace, and civil procedure. So apart from that, you wear other many impressive hats. A Supreme Court analyst for CNN, creator and editor of One First, which from my perspective is one of the most informative newsletters on all things constitutional law in the US, and we'll link to that, of course, in the show notes. You have a New York Times best-selling book, The Shadow Docket, how the Supreme Court uses stealth rulings to amass power and undermine the Republic. And I think you called, with a number of other people, the second Trump presidency and the amount of power Trump claims unprecedented. So let's dive right in. So the first question or area that we want to touch on is what I would call the deconstruction of the administrative state. And he wanted to initially say, sort of drain the swamp. Can you run us through at least some of sort of the major hallmarks, and if there is some kind of plan behind the gutting of USAID, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the lawyers in all layers of government, military, rank and file, the Southern District of New York with the Adams Affair? Try to make sense of this for us, please.
So I think there are two different things that are going on, and they overlap, but they're not the same. The first is that I think there is a widespread plan, much of which was previewed as part of Project 2025, to basically eviscerate the government's enforcement capacity in a whole bunch of different contexts, basically to make it much, much harder for the federal government to do a lot of things that, for whatever reason, Trump and his circle don't want the federal government to be doing. So whether that's, looking closely at Elon Musk's business transactions, or whether that's providing, health supplies and medical care to people in Africa. I mean, whatever it is, right? Instead of trying to get Congress to repeal the policies, just choke them and starve them to death by, stopping the spending of money Congress has appropriated, almost certainly illegally, and by removing the people who are actually carrying those policies out into action, so that with no money and with no people, right, there's nothing that can be done. So I think that's part one. Part two is, for those parts of the government that are still going to have stuff to do, ensuring that all of the relevant decision makers are Trump loyalists, and are the kinds of people who are going to say, yes, sir, thank you, sir, may I have another, as opposed to, we shouldn't do this, it's illegal. And so, there are lots of contexts where those two are overlapping, but I think they're distinct phenomena that are showing up in dozens really of flashpoints.
Steve, can I ask, because maybe for some of our listeners in Australia and outside of the US, this might be helpful. From what I understand, the first point is kind of this, method of achieving a policy outcome or a lack of policy outcome by another method. If we can't remove the authority to take a step or perform an action, we can remove the operational capacity to do that, and we arrive at the same result. The second objective that you see behind these changes and the sort of gutting of government departments is around ensuring partisan actors who are loyal to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement more broadly. To what extent is that a departure from the norm? Because here in Australia, we have a government bureaucracy that generally is durable, except at the very highest echelons to changes of government. But I understand that's not always the case in the US.
So, I mean, we are, I think in that respect, David, superficially similar, or at least we have been historically. So, the best way to sort of shorthand the federal executive branch is there are three kinds of people. There are three kinds of positions. There are what the Constitution refers to as principal officers. And so those are the senior cabinet ministers, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And those have always been political. Those officers serve at the pleasure of the president. Once the Senate confirms them, they wake up in the morning and they go to bed at night to do the president's bidding. There's a mid-level officer, which the Supreme Court refers to as inferior officers, which are, you might think of as sort of like deputy level folks or sort of mid-level executives who have some authority, but who are not, in charge of anything substantial all on their own. That has been a bit of a tug of war, David, historically, between Congress and the president over how much control Congress can assert over these people. Can Congress protect them from being fired except for cause, for example? But then there's the civil service. Then there is the vast pool of people who are, for lack of a better term, employees of the federal government. They're not officers in the sense of the Constitution. And, David, even the most zealous advocates of executive power, at least before the Trump administration, didn't think that and didn't argue that the president's control of the executive branch had to extend to employees, that the president could hire and fire janitors, for example, who are, cleaning up government buildings. We've had a civil service in the United States really for the better part of 150 years at this point. And I think one of the remarkable things Trump is doing is hollowing that out, both by claiming authority over the civil service that we've never seen before, and by just making it unbearable, even for those who haven't been fired, to continue working under these conditions.
Yeah, I guess we'll get onto it when we start talking about DOGE, but we can see some other vectors of attack there, or other vectors of exerting influence over the rank and file, I suppose, that third category of civil servant, in the way they're doing their jobs and the way they kind of demonstrate loyalty or at least compliance with the people in the cabinet room.
Yeah, so Steve, you touched upon a whole bunch of things. I don't even know where to start because it's just so confusing. The spigot, the fire hose, or whatever we want to call it. But you touch on DOGE, and I just want to, I call it the non-department because it's obviously not a department in the traditional sense. And I think that needs to be clarified every time you mention that, at least I do, because otherwise it becomes normalized and everyone thinks it's a regular department, which is a different thing. What is Elon Musk in the panoply of officials that you just laid out? Does he just fall somewhere in between, and is that part of the plan? Is he appointed? Is he anointed? I listened to a podcast between Larry Tribe and McConnell, and they were talking about completely different things, right? In terms of what he is, he's not, and you might have heard the same podcast. Yep. And I'm thinking, we're completely talking past one another, which just seems to be a sign of the times. So what is Elon Musk in sort of that cabinet level inferior officer or regular employee? Probably none of the above, right? And he falls in between.
I mean, I think If we had a grand vizier in the United States, I think that might be the right title.
Right.
I think the problem is that the government has itself been cagey about this. I mean, the Justice Department lawyers in court have had difficulty explaining exactly what his role is. Trump convened this unscheduled cabinet meeting last week, seemingly only for the purpose of saying publicly that Elon's not in charge of anything. To try to help those Justice Department lawyers. It has a bit of a whack-a-mole feeling to it, where, Musk is whatever he needs to be to not be subject to relevant legal authority. And Markus, that's a problem unto itself. I mean, the U.S. Supreme Court has spent most of the last 40 years, turning toward a more formalistic approach to separation of powers questions entirely to promote accountability. And the idea that brighter lines and clearer, pathways to who's responsible is better for holding the government to account. And Elon's the antithesis of that. So I guess, the best answer is certainly there are people doing his bidding who are officers. Whether they're doing his bidding because they report to him, or whether they're doing his bidding because they know they'll be fired by Trump if they don't. The reality is that his actual status is less important than the ability of U.S. courts to say, well, whether you're doing this at Elon's directive or not, I can still tell the Secretary of the Treasury to stop. And that's why these lawsuits have been able to proceed at least thus far, even with this uncertainty as to Elon's exact status.
I mean, I don't disagree, right? It's sort of extraordinary, though, that now apparently Musk hands out his personal phone number, or there might be an actual White House line that now says, you members of Congress, as a sort of supposed co-equal branch of government.
Yes.
That is now sort of saying, well, here's a phone number that you can call if you don't like what we're doing. I almost want to say, so suck it, right? And that's all it is.
Right. The phone number to me is Article 1, Section 7, which says Congress can pass laws by enacting them. I mean, there's this stunningly there's this stunning not just acquiescence by congressional Republicans, but there's been this stunning falling in by a lot, although not all, of the sort of right-wing legal commentary in the United States, with the idea that these formalisms don't matter, when they've spent the entire history of the conservative legal movement in the United States arguing for formalism as the sine qua non of constitutional interpretation in this space. And so now it's oh, who needs the formalities? Just call Elon and he'll fix it. And never mind that he's not actually fixing it. This is not how our Constitution is supposed to work. It's not how it ever has worked. And frankly, I mean, guys, there's a reason why so far Trump is faring so poorly in court. Judges of, both Democratic and Republican political backgrounds aren't buying it, and for good reason.
I mean, that certainly seems to be the character of Elon Musk's role in the government and DOGE's role in the government, from my observation, is one of kind of acquiescence and consent, right? We saw that in the first cabinet meeting. Is anyone uncomfortable with him being here? And, if so, he can leave. This kind of idea of, well, we don't need to worry so much about the formalities, provided everyone agrees with me that it's a good thing he's doing. And some recent polling suggests that more Americans than not support DOGE's federal government cuts.
Yes and no. I mean, I think that polling's tricky, David, because first of all, a lot of those cuts have not actually hit everyday Americans yet. I mean, there's a reason why they started with foreign aid. When those cuts start showing up in meat inspections and sort of highway safety, I suspect folks' tunes might change.
Pandemic prevention.
Exactly. Weather forecasts, right? The problem is, I mean, lawyers, I think, understand this at an intuitive level in a way that non-lawyers don't. The process has value, right? There's a reason why we don't just have a random guy who we call to fix things, right? There's a reason why we have procedure, and procedure exists to reduce the risk of both type 1 and type 2 error. When you don't have procedure, you're going to have a lot of error, and you're injecting a heck of a lot more room for arbitrariness and for retaliation and for vindictiveness, all of the things that process is supposed to guard against to ensure that you have a government that's operating by law, right, as opposed to by diktat.
Yeah, I suppose it's not that surface level of acquiescence. It's not sort of really about we think constitutionally and philosophically and politically that acquiescence or consent is, on its own sufficient. It's that I think when someone displays a hesitation about whether or not that acquiescence or consent is sufficient for Elon Musk and DOGE to have a role in government, that's an effective means of identifying dissenters or future dissenters.
And I think that's the, the sort of the elephant in the room as all this is happening is the just unprecedented amount of, naked political retaliation that we're seeing. And retaliation that, conservatives spent the last 4 years complaining was happening to them when it wasn't. And now it's actually happening in spades. And so, I think the next round of litigation, we're already knee deep, we're 100 and some odd lawsuits in less than 7 weeks. I think the next round of litigation is going to have a lot of First Amendment claims baked into it about, actions that maybe the government had the right to take in the abstract, but that it took for improper purposes. Where there's, retaliating against people because of constitutionally protected speech is supposed to be a no-no, and yet the free speech warriors apparently aren't actually invested in the free speech of people with whom they disagree.
That's chilling. So let's jump to the courts, because initially we were going to talk about Congress next, but let's jump to the courts because I think that's a nice segue. So you said there's a whole bunch of cases already, and I think that list will grow and grow and grow, and I suspect you're going to be part of one or two of them at some point potentially. But the one thing that really...
Hopefully not as a plaintiff.
Well, hopefully not, but who knows? We'll get to the letter that was sent to your dean not long ago.
Yeah.
So Vance made this statement: judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. So that's a separation of powers question, as the lawyers would call it, right? So, but I think the word legitimate power does a heavy lifting. There's a lot of heavy lifting here, because at least when I taught U.S. constitutional law, we all thought about, well, there's three branches of government, they're co-equal in whatever that means, and that we need to figure out how we do the checks and balances. That seems to be completely out the window. And the one thing I couldn't help myself seeing is this "thank you again, I won't forget it" comment when Trump left the joint session of Congress, right?
Yep. The Chief Justice Roberts.
What happens... Chief Justice Roberts, yeah, sorry. What happens when the Trump administration starts to really defy the courts, never mind his protestations that he will just appeal to the contrary? Because I suspect that at some point that will have to happen, right? If you want to push that project through and there's someone pushing back against you, which might be the courts, what happens? Because I don't think that's happened before in the way that we could now see.
So, I guess I'm of two minds of this. The first thing is, I don't know that it's a given, Marcus, that he will ignore the courts. I think, react slowly, sure, sort of not hustle to enforce, sure, but actually stick his thumb in the court's eye. I don't know. I think the risk he runs by doing that is, there may be just enough Republicans left in Congress for whom going after the court is the last straw. Not lower court judges. We're not going to stand up for district judges appointed by Democratic presidents. But we're going after the Supreme Court would be a bridge too far. And Trump really is dependent right now, to a degree that may not be visible, on the fact that congressional Republicans are rolling over. And so I think he'd be very wary about doing something that might upset that apple cart. The other thing is, as much as Trump might want to defy an adverse ruling in, say, the birthright citizenship case, he needs the courts, because a lot of his policy stuff actually depends on the courts. Immigration proceedings depend upon courts. And so, it would be one thing to defy the court at a time when you just don't need him anymore. But I actually am not sure that, it would be sustainable on his end, given that the powers the courts would have to basically sort of, stop indulging government lawsuits at that point. So I'm worried a lot less about the sort of defiance of the courts piece than about all of the damage that can be done before the courts actually conclusively say, no, you've gone too far, you have to stop.
I'll give you that. But let me push a little bit, right? And look, we can all look at any kind of comment by Musk and so forth on X saying about we'll have to impeach judges, right? But My actual concern is that given the almost complete disregard that Trump has for separation of powers, why should he stop at the courts, right? So the question, I guess, is, Steve, are you too much of a proceduralist, right? And I'm with you on procedure being important, right? I meant to ask that before. It's like, are we too much of a proceduralist? And isn't this just cutting through a sort of I don't know, some kind of visceral reaction by the public that just says, we don't want all this procedure because it gums things up, which is exactly what Trump seems to be feeding off of all the time when he does sort of his, we need to short circuit things in order to get things done. And I'm thinking, especially the topic that you talked about, immigration, as almost one of the prime examples, where at least as of this morning, we have this either current or former student at Columbia that all of a sudden, who is a green card holder, and gets sort of into deportation proceedings, I think in Louisiana, because that's just the obvious place where someone in New York goes. So I guess question, are we too much of a proceduralism sort of adherence in that sense?
Probably, but without procedure, what's left? I mean, I guess I spent a lot of time with my students on a line that Justice Robert Jackson wrote in one of the McCarthy era immigration cases that, if put to a choice between living in a world with Soviet procedural rules and American substantive law, or Soviet substantive law and American procedural rules, we'd all choose the latter. Right? That yes, there might be a sort of a small cohort of people to whom getting rid of process is valuable in the short term, but wait till it's their ox that's being gored. I mean, I think the problem is that it doesn't take much to show them why you actually look at all the Trump supporters who can't believe that their family members were fired from the VA. Oh, surely you didn't mean to fire my family member, right? It's like, well, actually, we're not being very specific here. So, Markus, even if you're not gonna die on the hill that you shouldn't have to pass a loyalty test to work for the government, it seems like at least we should have as a fallback position that process is what separates us from just the will of crazy people. Whether Trump is crazy as a fox or just crazy, I leave for others.
Right. So before we get to some of that, relationship to Congress. I found his speech to the joint session of Congress, not a State of the Union address, showed priorities, but it showed no priorities in terms of legislative rulemaking. It showed priorities for executive rulemaking from sort of the throne, if you will, that's now the White House. Am I just being I've left the U.S. a few years ago, right? So I think 2016. Am I just too far removed, or is this actually what's happening? Because again, I didn't hear much in terms of this is what I think Congress should do. It's more like I'm going to use what I called illegal executive orders when someone else was in power, and I'm going to just push through whatever I want. Where do you see that relationship between Congress, the current one, and Trump going?
Honestly, I think it depends on the economy. At the moment.
Well, he's wrecking that literally at the moment, right?
Right. No, but that's the thing. I mean, I think the problem is that, in an ideal world for Trump, right, the relationship he had for the first 7 weeks would persist, where, the Senate just rubber stamps even completely unqualified nominees, and where the House does nothing to push back against the arrogation of its appropriations power. And, Markus, that can't hold in a world in which Trump causes a massive recession because, all 435 members of the House have to run for election next November. And even the ones who are in relatively safe red districts, are not going to be able to go home and say, what did I do over the last 2 years? I supported Trump while he wrecked the economy. So I think, how much wiggle room he has with Congress really is going to depend upon just how bad the economic numbers get, because, until they get bad or until he does something else like defying the courts, I think Republicans will generally remain in lockstep. But as soon as things get totally underwater, one of the only upsides of the Democrats having absolutely no power right now is that there's no plausible argument that it's their fault.
Right. Right. Well, TBD. I honestly hope you're right. Let's go to the silencing of critics, because that's another thing that sort of then worries me. And we've seen this with federal workers, lawyers, FBI agents of all people, veterans of all people, in terms of layoffs, but also silencing them, pretty much anyone and everyone. You had this sort of post-Zelensky White House meeting, Republican senators changing their tune who wanted to support him initially, Zelensky and Ukraine. Hegseth confirmation hearing, resistance fairly quickly quashed. The political friends, enemies for sure. And then you have the public, including universities. And we will link to that. The letter sent to your dean, William Trenor, and I know Bill a little bit from my time in the US. Then you have the media, you have law firms. So the US is being portrayed around the world as this beacon of free expression, never mind that it probably never existed in the way that everyone thought it did. But what is happening there? Is this just, again, trying to silence critics in order to gain some larger... What's the larger project behind all of this? And are you feeling free to speak because that's just what you do? Or are you being told by university administration, well, there's $400 million on the line for Columbia, you better not say much?
All right, there's a lot going on here.
Indeed.
So again, I think there are two overlapping things going on. I think the first is that Trump wants to do whatever he can to, either entice or coerce people into agreeing with him. And so part of this is just a vanity project where if you're opposed to me, I want to make your life difficult. And that's classic, malignant narcissistic bullying behavior where it's just, I'm gonna make it worth your while to be my friend and not my enemy, right? So that's part one. And then part two is, if you actually wanted to put more intelligence and thought into this, right? Identifying people who can be blamed for the problems that Trump supporters are facing so that they don't blame him. Right. So it's, what's wrong with college athletics? Oh, it's the 9 transgender individuals among the 50,000 NCAA, college athletes. Like what's wrong with, student protests? Oh, well, it's not that they're not students, they're paid agitators. Right. It is an effort to both, compel fealty and scare sort of the gullible Trump supporters into thinking that someone's out to get them and it's not who they think, right? So those two things overlap. As for me, Markus, you mentioned off the top that I just moved back to DC last summer from a stint doing 8 years at the University of Texas.
I forgot that. Yes, you were. There was a time when you were in Texas, correct?
And not just in Texas, but at the University of Texas, which is a public school, and a public school that the legislature in recent years has been much more willing to come after. I don't know if I would have felt less comfortable being as public as I've been if I were still at Texas, but I suspect I would have had a couple of conversations with the dean about, when to maybe sit one out versus when not to. But man, I am today a tenured white male professor at a prominent law school that is at a private university in a very blue jurisdiction. If I can't speak out, then the ship has sailed. Then no one can. And I think it's you're right that there are people who are being chilled into not speaking out, whether it's big corporate law firms or whether it's government employees. I guess I'll just say I think so far there have been enough people who are speaking out, right? That chilling has not, I think, succeeded. But, I said this a bit earlier. The next round of litigation is going to have a lot of First Amendment stuff in it. I think it's going to be very important for courts to stand up for the First Amendment rights of the people who are speaking out, especially those, unlike me, who are suffering consequences in response. Can
I just follow up really quickly on this? And I take what you said, and I think that's going to happen, but I think it's complicated, right? So a law firm like Covenant and Burling, because they represented Jack Smith, get sort of a wink and a nod, and others as well, or they get their licenses or their security clearances revoked because, well, you're not going to work for us any longer. Does that have sort of a long-term chilling effect? Because now some partners, between the different partners of law firms, say, well, you're now cutting into my sort of you're cutting into my flesh. And therefore, it's sort of not the direct, but the indirect effects, all of this, or whatever, the CBS potential revoking of licenses, or the ABC case, but broadcasters in the US, right? Is there something there?
Yeah. I mean, we started this conversation talking about how the dismantling of the administrative state kind of cuts to government departments could be a road to a policy outcome by another means. Remove the operational capacity of a government department to do the things that you don't like, and that's just as good as removing its authority to do it. I almost see a version of that strategy in what's happened with these two law firms. I read some fantastic reporting from the New York Times on this morning. By having their security clearances revoked, we're talking about what the next round of litigation might look like. To what extent is the operational capacity of the round of litigation after that curtailed when we start disempowering the law firms who might reasonably be expected to act in that litigation from acting?
So I think it's a serious concern, David. We're not there yet. So one story that came out earlier today, it's somehow still Monday here in America. Right, was that the law firm Williams and Connolly is actually going to represent Perkins Coie in litigation challenging the Trump executive order going after them. That to me is a hopeful sign, because Williams and Connolly is a big, powerful law firm, and it's making a very big public statement by telling the world that it's going to represent Perkins Coie. So David, this is why I say I think we're at an important moment, but we haven't tipped one way or the other yet. Right? There's still plenty of capacity at the moment for law firms to represent law firms, et cetera. What I worry about is these cases failing, and then that sort of clearing the decks for more aggressive activity going forward. And that's why I think folks like me are watching all of this ongoing litigation so carefully. Taking away money from Columbia University, like that's illegal, and that lawsuit should succeed if Columbia brings it. But the question is, how do these test cases, because they are in many respects test cases, right? How do they actually? How do we do on the test? I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that we'll pass a bunch of the tests, but I also am pragmatic and realistic enough to know that we won't pass all of them.
Something that Markus and I have been discussing before we started recording was, what is the end game of this, right? We're describing a process, a path towards something. I guess this is the part of the show where we engage in some wild guessing, although maybe, Steve, it's less of a wild guess for you. What is the end game here? What is the end state that these curtailments of speech, these reprisals, these changes to the administrative state are intended to achieve?
The reason why I think that's a tough question, David, is I think different people who are invested in achieving that end state would answer that question differently. So I think for a lot of the money that is supporting all of this mess, the end game is deregulatory. The end game is just, let us, not pay taxes on our billions of dollars, and let us not be regulated by the government. Let us, let basically the market run everything, and not the government. That's the sort of, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the Silicon Valley Trump sympathist perspective from the end of last year, right?
But so Steve, let me ask this: is it only Silicon Valley, right? So
No.
I think on the outside it is at this point, but there's others, right? I mean, this goes way back. 100 years? In the case that now eludes me, which I'm sure you have in mind as well. so please help me, I guess, is the question of sort of the famous deregulatory case in the 1920s.
Yeah,
Lochner. From Lochner, yes, sorry. Just as you were like starting, I was like, yeah, Lochner. But it isn't just Silicon Valley, right? It's more than that. It's sort of this broader swath of deregulatory that's been in the Republican Party for some time.
I mean, big power, big energy companies, right? That face a catastrophic existential threat from climate change oriented regulations, right? I mean, it runs the gamut. But so I think there's one chunk of folks for whom this is purely economic. And then there's one chunk of folks for whom this is purely ideological. And it really is about, us versus them. And, some of that has an element of white supremacy baked into it, but not all of it. Some of it has a very strong, nationalist connotation to it, but not all of it. I mean, right? Even those are overlapping. So part of the problem is that I don't think that there's a single end game. I think there are different end games depending upon which chunk of the Trump sort of critical support system you're asking. But I think the problem is that, I don't think any of that is going to be ultimately sustainable. Like, I don't think we're heading for, the end of things in the United States. But, like in The Great Gatsby, I mean, they're going to break everything along the way. And the question is going to be, how does the next generation pick up the pieces? And, it is not going to be possible to restore to fix the damage that Trump has done just in the first 7 weeks of this presidency. I would say even in the first 7 years, right afterwards. And that's what I think is most depressing to people like me is that, yes, a lot of bad stuff is happening today, but, even in a world in which we can get back to a better place, it's not going to be as easy as flipping a switch. It's going to require a heck of a lot of long-term reinvestment in not just, government infrastructure, but in the idea that government infrastructure matters and in persuading, the American people that like the federal government actually is here to help you. And that's going to take a long time.
Yeah. I mean, what you described there is kind of like a broad coalition, around some of these changes, right? A set of kind of not necessarily mutually exclusive, but pretty diverse ideological drivers there.
I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about a president who was elected, with not just less than half of the popular vote, but with, less than 30% of eligible voters voting for him in the entire country. And a lot of those folks are voting for him because they've been sold a bill of goods by right-wing media. That just isn't true, right? So, I think part of the problem here is that Trump, at the end of the day, has to walk at least a relatively delicate tightrope to keep all of his bases of support in line. Because if he wrecks the economy, he loses one big chunk of people. If he softens on culture war and social issues, he loses a different big chunk of people, right? And so, somehow it is depressing and embarrassing that was a big enough coalition to get him elected after what happened in 2021. But it's hard to imagine it getting any bigger. And so, the question then becomes, what are the downstream electoral consequences when, this kind of government, which can't possibly succeed in the long term, produces effects that even people who are otherwise inclined to put blinders on can't ignore anymore.
Yeah, and that's some of the opinion I've been reading recently, which I guess is, at what point do we hit peak DOGE, or kind of the zenith of Trump's power to dismantle the federal government? At what point do we start to see a decline, either because of external factors, a recession is driving a change in priorities for the voter, or because of internal pressures? Republican lawmakers are finally saying, well, actually, this goes beyond what I'm comfortable with. Do you think we've reached that point, or is that coming in the future?
So I don't think we've reached that point, but I think it's closer than people might expect. And there are sort of two different reasons why. The first is, we mentioned this briefly earlier. Right now Trump is operating off of a budget Congress already passed. Our Constitution requires Congress to pass appropriations every year. And so, Trump is going to need Congress to at least fund what he wants to do starting next year. So, David, the clock is already running out on his ability to just act completely without Congress. And that, of course, brings with it a whole bunch more leverage. So, in that sense, some of the sort of energy here might be reflecting the fact that Trump knows, or at least his advisors know, that they really only have until the end of whatever the current, shutdown crisis is, to really operate without Congress. But the second part, and I hate saying this, but I got to say it, is, something's going to happen. For George W. Bush, it was a hurricane, right? And for Trump's first term, it was a pandemic. Something is going to happen that is going to reveal that the emperor has no clothes, that is going to highlight in, just absolutely undeniable circumstances, just why this is not an effective way of governing. And I just hope that when it happens, it doesn't result in a lot of human misery. Right? Whether it's a whole bunch of plane crashes because they've gutted the FAA, or whether it's, a foodborne epidemic because they've, messed with food inspections, or whatever it is, there's going to be some crisis that, if not caused by the federal government's hollowing out, is going to be exacerbated by the federal government's hollowing out. And if Trump hasn't already lost his, non-mandate by then, he will. So, I think the question is really at this point more, how long can this go on versus will it succeed? And I don't mean to be optimistic, a ton of bad stuff has already happened. It is going to be really hard to undo the bad stuff that's already happened. But there are various reasons to be at least cautiously optimistic that, even though we're only 7 weeks in, this is not something that can be sustained over 4 years.
So I think that almost gets us to the end, because I was going to ask you what gives you hope, right? And I'm a German, but an optimist, which is an oxymoron in its own right. And Steve, I was a little bit more optimistic. A friend of mine asked me the other day whether Trump has reached his zenith already, right? And I actually said, yes, he has. And not in visible ways to the outside world, but all these sort of rifts or ruptures that you see between, say, Marco Rubio, who, for all intents and purposes, being made out to be like a smart cookie in the room, but that just says something about the room rather than Marco Rubio from my perspective, right? Look, I don't think he was ever the smartest cookie in the room, but at the moment he seems to be, apart from Vance, who I actually think is fairly dangerous, right? But there's these ruptures between various parts of the administration and Musk on the other hand. And also, as you said, there are different motivations, if you will. The deregulatory side, again, maybe exemplified by Musk, but also by the Koch brothers and others. And then you have this sort of more committed ideological base. And somewhere, I think these ruptures are starting to emerge. And what Trump's doing at the moment with either tariffs or exemplified again by Ukraine isn't helping on the outside world either. So maybe that's the one hope that I don't have at the moment, is that the Democrats are actually in a place that they can push back as much as they would need to do.
Earlier in our conversation, we were talking about what role, to the extent he has any, Elon Musk has in the cabinet, in the government, and that is kind of a, clap your hands if you believe kind of role, right? He's there because everyone is happy for him to be there. He's there because there is no dissenting voice that's asking him to leave, to Trump's example in the first cabinet meeting. We're talking about whether Trump will soon reach the zenith of his power or whether it's beginning to decline. How long until that starts to happen for Elon Musk?
It's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the film Goodfellas. But there's, there comes a point where even the person who thinks he's going to be a made man is still vulnerable. That's a very, very inside baseball reference, or I guess even inside cricket. I don't know if that's even what we do. But
hey, don't go to the cricket side. Come on, it's still soccer somewhere along the line. Football is real sport.
I'll leave the sports jousting for later. David, I don't know. I think I'm a bit surprised he's made it this long. it is not hard to imagine that there's some kind of big falling out between Trump and Musk if there comes a point at which Trump decides that Musk is getting in his way. But, I think there also may be a degree to which they're now joined at the hip. And, the sort of what takes one of them down is going to take the other down. I mean, I think that's the question. What the larger and more important point, right? And I think this is something that I've been trying to persuade my students of, is that the reality at the end of the day is that it's not nearly as important what exact role Elon Musk is playing specifically as it is what he and his minions are doing. And, that can continue even if Elon is somehow sidelined as a figurehead. And so to me, the real question, again, is not about Elon or Trump specifically. It's about the point at which what the executive branch is doing crosses some not yet visible line where at least some number of congressional Republicans have to get off the train. And, just to make the point really directly, the Republican majority in both chambers of Congress right now is razor thin. It would not take that many Republicans in the House and the Senate to basically grind all of Trump's stuff to a halt. And so, this is why I'm not sure I agree with Markus that we've reached the zenith, but we might be a lot closer than folks realize. And in retrospect, this might be sort of a flash in the pan as opposed to a sustained, the most famous first couple of months of a presidency in American history are Roosevelt's first 100 days. We're like just about halfway. And I'm not sure that this attitude and this approach and this kind of behavior is going to make it to 100 days, let alone to 4 years.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Steve, can I just say thank you again for joining us on our guest inaugural episode. This was terrific, and if you're not too put off by this conversation, maybe we'll have to have you back on at some point when we reach our 100th episode. So thanks so much for your insights.
Maybe even in person.
Maybe even in person, but probably outside of the U.S. Again, thanks so much, and we really appreciate you taking the time, and much longer than we initially asked you to stay on.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it.
No, happy to do it. Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate your having me.
So this is our first episode of the show. We're going to end every episode of the show with a lighter segment. Sometimes we talk about some pretty heavy stuff. So we're going to try and finish with something lighter every episode. That might be talking about a lighter story that's in the news and kind of what it tells us about politics, the law, or economics. Today, we're going to be sharing some reading recommendations. Markus, can I go first? Can I recommend you something to read?
Oh, absolutely. Please go.
Okay, and this is not a recently published work. This is a series of essays published from the start of 2023 to mid last year, August 2024. But it's a great series of essays, and if you spend any amount of time thinking about artificial intelligence, as I tend to do a lot, running a legal technology company, it's a great one to read. This is a series of essays published in The New Yorker by Ted Chiang, who's a brilliant speculative fiction writer. Even if you've never read his work, like the brilliant collection of short stories, Exhalation. You might have seen the movie Arrival, starring Amy Adams and Jeremy Renner, which is based on one of his short stories. Ted Chiang wrote a series of essays for The New Yorker. I don't know if they were intended to be a series, but they do make a nice set of works about artificial intelligence, its capacities and its limitations. And the last one, especially published in August 2024, is fantastic. It's titled Why AI Isn't Going to Make Art. And it is about art. It's about the artistic process and it's about creativity, but it's also about writing. And, Markus, you and I do a lot of writing for different purposes. We write for academic purposes. We write for business purposes. We write for personal purposes. And this essay has a lot to say about the act of writing and why we write as people. And it really articulates a lot of my own apprehensions about using AI for writing. A lot of people I speak to are surprised, I think, when they learn that I don't really use generative AI for any kind of writing, given the work I do. I don't want to read the whole thing, obviously, but I do want to read a little part of it. There's a passage in the essay about, I don't know if you remember seeing this ad, Markus. There was an ad that Google released maybe during the Olympics to promote Gemini. it featured a little girl wanting to write a letter to her hero, an Olympic athlete. And her father suggested that they use Gemini to write it for them, and then they send it to the athlete, and the athlete is touched to receive this AI-generated letter. I'm just going to read from the essay now for a moment. Google pulled the commercial after widespread backlash from viewers. A media professor called it one of the most disturbing commercials I've ever seen. It's notable that people reacted this way, even though artistic creativity isn't the attribute being supplanted. No one expects a child's fan letter to an athlete to be extraordinary. If the young girl had written the letter herself, it would likely have been indistinguishable from countless others. The significance of the fan letter, both to the child who writes it and to the athlete who receives it, comes from it being heartfelt rather than from its being eloquent. Many of us have sent store-bought greeting cards knowing that it will be clear to the recipient that we didn't compose the words ourselves. We don't copy the words from a Hallmark card in our own handwriting. That would feel dishonest. That's the end of the extract of the essay I wanted to read. It's this great articulation of what writing is, not about the text when we write. Writing is about communicating with other human beings. It's about thinking as well. I find writing to be a reflective task. There's lots of articles I've started writing that I've never finished because halfway through writing them I realize, this isn't a very good idea on reflection, and I don't continue. And it's also about feeling. That example of the child's fan letter, it's about having a heartfelt reaction both to producing the writing and to reading it. And I think all of those things are reasons why I don't really like using AI for writing, even business writing. And it's such a beautiful articulation of those ideas by an incredibly talented author. And so, Markus, this week I suggest you read Ted Chiang's AI essays in The New Yorker.
I will, and I'll probably pass it on to my students, saying that when they do their assignments, do not use AI. Although I think that ship has sailed. So I will link it to the article in the show notes, and I'm definitely going to have a read this week. Sounds fascinating. So my own recommendation is something completely out of left field. It's a website called Recipe Tin Eats, and Nagi Mayahashi and her dog Dozer. The latter is a very quintessential feature of each recipe. Are sort of my stars when I have to go and want to cook something new. So I arrived in Australia in 2018, I think now. Yeah, and maybe by happenstance or because how the algorithms work, I was looking for some new recipes, and I really haven't looked back since. It's beautiful photography and videography. It's easy to navigate. Almost no pop-ups, I think, and advertisement that gets in the way, which happens a lot with these things. There's a not-for-profit food bank attached to it, and I've cooked many a recipe from that. If you just need to look at something, and we're not sponsored by Recipe Tin Eats, but fantastic website that also involves her own backstory. She's a former PwC auditor who then teaches herself how to cook. And the amount of work and the amount of detail that's in each of these recipes is, to my mind, just amazing. And she's crafted a community around her. Highly recommend it. On that note, we'll end. Thanks for being with us, everyone. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. See you on the next episode.
The Civic Podcast is presented by David Turner and myself, Markus Wagner. Help us spread the word by telling others about the podcast. For more information, visit us on thecivicpodcast.com. Our handle on the socials is The Civic Podcast. The production team consists of Irene Bijou, Justin Bortignon, Jacqueline Malafe, and Jacob Malby. On behalf of David Turner and myself, thank you for listening.